The blood drained from the Soviet translator's face as he stared at General George S. Patton. The young man stood paralyzed, gripped by the terror of repeating the words the American commander had just uttered. Across the hall, Marshal Georgy Zhukov waited. The most lethal commander in the Red Army stood stone-faced, demanding a translation. This was meant to be a moment of Allied diplomacy in Bavaria. Instead, Patton had launched a verbal assault. It was a direct strike against Stalin's regime. It was so savage, the translator feared none of them would leave the room alive. To grasp how these two titans reached this flashpoint, we must look at the ruins of their conquest. In the occupation zones of Germany, the reality was far from the smiling official photographs. The atmosphere between American and Soviet officers was brittle. It was dangerous. They clashed over borders. They fought over resources and the fate of prisoners. They argued over who truly broke the back of the German war machine. At the center of this storm stood Patton. He was a man incapable of hiding his true thoughts. Patton never disguised his deep contempt for the Soviets. He believed the American advance had been strangled at the worst possible hour. Even before the guns fell silent, Patton was sounding the alarm. Other generals played the diplomat. Patton spoke the brutal truth. The Red Army was not an ally. It was a looming threat. He considered it a historic tragedy that Washington halted at the Elbe River. In his eyes, the United States should have charged straight to Moscow while its military was the most powerful force on Earth. In 1945, these views were poison in Washington. General Eisenhower wanted them silenced. Neither Roosevelt nor Truman shared his vision. Yet Patton roared his defiance anyway. He did so loudly and repeatedly. That was his nature. By late summer, a formal gala was staged in Bavaria. It was designed to showcase Allied unity and celebrate the victory. Patton's staff was terrified. His aides begged him to be civil. They reminded him the Soviets were still official partners. They pleaded for caution. Patton met their pleas with a familiar cold stare. It was the look of a commander who had already chosen his path. He would do exactly as he pleased. Heading the Soviet party was Zhukov. To students of history, his name carries the weight of iron. He was the supreme architect of Soviet survival. He was the man who held Moscow, broke the enemy at Stalingrad, and finally seized Berlin. His uniform was heavy with medals. He was the living icon of the Great Patriotic War. Zhukov was a force of nature. He was broad-shouldered and radiated a terrifying authority. It was the confidence of a man who had commanded more souls in battle than almost any other officer in history. Zhukov had heard the name Patton. In the Red Army, everyone had. But the reports from Soviet intelligence painted a specific picture. They did not focus on his victories. Instead, they highlighted his scandals, the slapping of soldiers, the political outbursts, the times his own superiors had sidelined him. In the Soviet military, a general who struck a subordinate faced a firing squad. To Zhukov, reliability and discipline were everything. He saw Patton not as a tactical genius. He saw an unstable man, a commander who could not control his own temper. Zhukov had survived the purges of Stalin. He understood the cold mechanics of power. He was not easily impressed by a man who lacked self-mastery. The reception began with rigid formality. Toasts were exchanged. Speeches were delivered with practiced precision. The two delegations stood apart. They maintained the hollow politeness of men ordered to be civil. Then the moment arrived. Zhukov and Patton found themselves face to face. Translators stood ready. A circle of officers watched in silence. The American records and the Soviet accounts differ on the specifics. Memories are often shaped by pride. Yet the core of the exchange remains undisputed. Zhukov spoke with his signature bluntness. He made a remark about the American drive through France and Germany. His words were a calculated strike. He suggested the Americans had simply moved through a vacuum. The Germans were already shattered. The Red Army had already broken them at Stalingrad and beyond. Zhukov claimed the Americans had not fired a shot that mattered. To him, chasing a retreating ghost was not a real battle. He essentially told Patton his victory was unearned. He was fighting an enemy that had no strength left. It was a deliberate insult. It was aimed directly at the commander of the Third Army. The room fell into a heavy silence. The staff of the Third Army held their breath. They knew the fire was coming. They could not stop it. Patton stared at Zhukov for a long, quiet moment. Then he smiled. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was the look his enemies feared most. It was a smile of a man who had already won the argument. Patton spoke through the translator with measured calm. He acknowledged the magnificent record of the Red Army. He expressed deep respect for the suffering of Soviet soldiers. Then the tone shifted. He offered to compare the records of the Third Army with any Soviet unit, mile by mile, battle by battle, casualty by casualty. He suggested the comparison would be quite educational. He finished with a final, cutting observation. In his experience, only one type of general belittles another. It is the general who fears his own record cannot withstand the same light. Patton spoke softly. He stated he had never required an ally to break an enemy before his arrival. He would not begin accepting that narrative now. The translator turned pale. Zhukov fixed his gaze on Patton. Silence smothered the room. Then Zhukov spat a Russian phrase the translator later deemed unfit for print. The Soviet delegation shifted. The tension in the air thickened. Zhukov issued a direct challenge to Patton's courage. He claimed it was easy to be bold in a room full of officers. The true test of a soldier was the falling of shells. He implied Patton performed bravery rather than practiced it. Zhukov had misread his man. Patton had faced fire in 2 world wars. He had led tank charges under direct bombardment. He stood on open ground during artillery strikes to be visible to his troops. To him, the accusation of cowardice was a joke. To hear it from a Soviet general in public was dangerous. Patton stepped toward Zhukov. His staff tensed. They were unsure whether to intervene. Patton looked Zhukov in the eye. He spoke with chilling calm. He offered to demonstrate his relationship with danger at any time. He told Zhukov to make a specific proposal. He wanted it loud enough for everyone to hear. 30 years of preparation had led to this. His record required no defense. Then he delivered the killing blow. He told Zhukov the most dangerous thing about the Red Army was not its brave soldiers. It was the generals. They had confused surviving Stalin with understanding war. This silence was different. It was the weight of words that could never be retracted. Zhukov did not speak. He watched Patton with a mix of fury and calculation. Perhaps it was a grudging recognition. Zhukov turned away. He spoke quietly to his staff. The Soviet group retreated to the far side of the hall. The 2 delegations remained apart for the rest of the night. The official report called the evening productive. It noted a frank exchange of views. In the cold rooms of high command, this was the vocabulary of a catastrophe. Everyone present felt the shift. For days, the staff of the Third Army scrambled to contain the wreckage. The Soviets had launched a formal protest through military channels. They targeted the American general's tone. Eisenhower's headquarters was not merely annoyed. They were furious. Patton was summoned to account for himself. He walked into that room with zero interest in being corrected. To him, an apology was a form of surrender. He looked Eisenhower's chief of staff in the eye. He told him he had represented American interests with total honesty. He had not started the fight. But he would never apologize for meeting a direct insult with a direct strike. If American policy meant standing silent while Soviets mocked their courage, then the policy was a failure. He would say as much to the President of the United States. The fire he started could not be extinguished. It only sped up a process that had been moving for months. In the quiet theater of post-war diplomacy, Patton was a man out of time. He was too blunt, too honest. He refused to play the part of the polished diplomat that the occupation required. He spoke his mind on the former Nazis. He spoke his mind on the Red Army. He even spoke openly of returning home to enter politics. To the man in Washington, his clock had run out. His utility ended when the guns fell silent. He had become a ghost in the machine, a problem that created more trouble than it solved. 3 months after that reception, Patton was removed from command of the Third Army. 3 months after that, he was gone. The accident was a low-speed collision. It was unlikely. It was fatal only to him. He died in a land he had just liberated. He was on a road he had no reason to travel. Even now, the circumstances remain a shadow. Zhukov outlived him by 29 years. He outlived Stalin. He survived being purged and restored to power twice. He survived the entire Cold War. He died in 1974 as the most decorated soldier in the history of the Soviet Union. Yet in all his memoirs, Zhukov never mentioned Bavaria. He never spoke of that conversation. It was a calculated omission. Zhukov remembered everything and forgot nothing. He only stayed silent on the things that still haunted him. To the Soviet military, Patton was the only American they truly feared. Their secret files, opened after the Cold War, were clear. He was dangerous. He was unpredictable. He was a man driven by belief, not by a career. That made him impossible to understand. It made him impossible to stop. The Soviet assessment reached a chilling conclusion. It was fortunate for Moscow that Patton was kept on a short leash by his superiors. Had he been given what he asked for, the world would be a different place. Patton would have considered that the highest possible praise. General Patton viewed most insults as highest praise. In 1945, at a formal reception in Bavaria, a Soviet general attempted to wound him. The officer called Patton a coward. The commander of the Third Army met the slur with a steady, haunting smile. He displayed the same absolute calm that defined his career. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. Patton never asked for permission to know who he was. He never let the world dictate his worth. Not the man who commanded him, not the enemies who feared him, and certainly not a Soviet general who mistook the art of surviving a dictator for the true meaning of a fight.